one of the reasons why I loved MIT so much was, and therefore loved engineering and technology so much, was this constant message that we got as undergrads. You are going to change the world and make it a better place. My name is Karen Howe. I am a journalist who covers artificial intelligence for publications like The Atlantic, and I'm the author of a new book, Empire of AI. And when I realized in Silicon Valley, better place is secondary to let's make people rich, um, it was heartbreaking. Like I picked that profession because I thought that ultimately I would find like-minded people that were working towards like missions to shape the world in the way that we wanted it to be. And it what like my coworkers were incredible. We were all mission-driven people, but it doesn't matter how amazing and talented and mission-driven all of the employees are, because ultimately what happened was VCs needed to make money. And that was ultimately the deciding factor for what the technology would be. And that was, I mean, I'm someone who's very decisive and quick to judge. It took only one moment, then I was like, I'm done, I'm out. I don't want to stick around and see what happens next.
I was actually thinking you did stick around because that story you just told is pretty much the story of the book you've written, okay, Empire of AI. That is, in a way, the story of OpenAI, something that starts out with a mission and has fast become something else. And a lot of people have been disillusioned along the way. So it feels like you are still trying to
Yeah,
make
I'm still
sense of
telling the
what
story.
happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the story of Silicon Valley over the last decade and a half. And, like I talk with my college friends all the time about this, that there is really this sense when we were in college that there was this beautiful green pasture that we were going into, and that there was all this optimism, and that we were all brimming with this energy of how do we when the thing that the president of MIT, when during my time there, what he would always say is hack the world to be a little bit more like MIT, like hack it to be a little bit more cosmopolitan, a little bit more global, a little bit more, scientific, and it was all these amazing, positive, feel good things, and that doesn't feel like the moment that we're in now with Silicon Valley, and I started hitting upon that friction quite early in my career, so I left after a year.
Out of the frying pan into the fire because you start covering this industry. Um, you know, given what you've just said, let's talk about open AI, right? And Sam Altman, because I know some people might be aware of the backstory here, but I do think it's worth mentioning, given what we're going to talk about later, which is kind of it's starting as this particular company in part because of the relationship between Sam Altman and Elon Musk. Talk about the philosophical conversation they had about
Yeah.
why they wanted to start this company.
So one thing that maybe many people didn't know until potentially recently is OpenAI started as a nonprofit. And the reason for that was Sam Altman, he was the president of Y Combinator at the time, which is one of the most acclaimed startup accelerators in Silicon Valley. It's launched many famous startups. And he had this idea that he wanted to take big swings around hard technologies. So he was investing more in quantum, in self-driving cars, in nuclear fusion, and
And we should say
also,
at that time, Silicon Valley's sort of churning out things that we can be describing as the Uber of X, the
yeah,
Airbnb of
Snapchat.
Y.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
They were sort of iterations on I'm not going to say novelty, but social media.
Yeah.
They were not taking big swings, so to speak. And so
Yes.
here he is, this guy who has like all the connections in the world, because literally that's what the Combinator is. It is just connection and
Yes, it was
networking
a
and connecting
very,
the money
very
to the
dense
ideas.
network.
He's the
Exactly.
guy at the heart of that, and he
Yeah.
decides to take a big swing.
And he thought, I want to create an AI lab that is a project within YC, within Y Combinator. He Altman is a very strategic person. He plays the long game, and one of the things he's very, very good at is getting talent and getting capital towards a specific objective. And so early on, he thought, who are the people that I need to recruit to this project to turn this into a legitimate lab? The first person that he identified was Elon Musk. And Musk at the time was talking very publicly, very often about his fears around AI. This idea that AI was going to be an all powerful technology, and therefore we need to be really cautious with how to develop it. And specifically, Musk was very obsessed with the fact that Google had a monopoly on some of the top AI research talent in the world. They had just made an acquisition of DeepMind, which is a London-based AI firm. And he thought it's not going to go well if AI is developed within a for-profit environment. So he was hosting dinners talking about this. He was doing the university circuit talking about this. He met multiple times with President Obama saying, this is something that needs to be on your radar. You absolutely need to regulate this technology. And so Altman, to recruit Musk, he starts saying to Musk, I am like-minded in your views about AI. I'm also worried about AI being very powerful and going wrong. And it seems to me that if it will stay within Google, it would go wrong. But the best way to counteract it is to create an AI lab of our own. So
For the good guys. And the
we will
reason why
be
I'm
the
raising
good
this,
guys.
we're going to be the good guys. Google is
Yes.
somehow evil. And it's interesting
Yes.
because we were talking to, I think, the founder of DeepMind, Mustafa Suleyman, who's now at Microsoft.
Yeah.
And like he started his companies because he wanted to be the good guy, right?
Yeah,
Everyone's
yeah.
the hero in the tech story of how they make things.
Yes.
And in this case, yeah, same thing.
Yeah, it's a very, very common theme in AI. Also just a very common theme in, everyone's human experience. Everyone is the main character of their story. Everyone is the one trying to do it better than, but you did hit upon something that is, I think, really key to understanding the AI world and how AI is being developed today is very much, there's a lot of ideological clash that happens where everyone fashions themselves as morally superior to the other, and therefore they have to be the one that is the CEO of a new company, and they're going to do it better than the previous one.
And over time, I feel like OpenAI becomes like a cautionary tale in a way of like how those ideologies can come to a head. And people may not remember this, but a while back, the company went through a transition where it moved from being kind of nonprofit oriented with a nonprofit board to that board essentially rebelling and saying, Sam Altman, actually, you're not such a great guy in how you treat us, but also, are you taking all the sort of safety mechanisms seriously that you could? This blows up and becomes an international news story, even though none of us really know why or how. We just know that there are some people saying that AI is super, super bad, and that he's not, heeding the guardrails, and
Yeah.
him being like, it's fine. These people, they're just, who knows what they're, I mean, who knows what could happen? And I see an echo of this conversation over and over again between the people you talk about, the boomers and the doomers.
Yes.
Who are those two factions, and how did they surface in OpenAI?
Yeah. So going back to this idea that there is an ideological clash that really shapes these technologies. One thing that's happened in the last few years within the AI world and within the Silicon Valley world is there are really what can only be described as quasi-religious movements that have been born.
Did you say quasi-religious?
Religious, yes, quasi-religious movements that have been born. And the reason I say this is because there are a lot of people within this world who believe in what I call the artificial general intelligence religion. This is a religion where you think that it is possible to recreate human intelligence. This is something that there isn't actually scientific consensus on this. So even the people who talk about this, they themselves talk about it as a belief. It's just you either have the belief or you don't. And if you do have the belief, then the second tenet is you believe it's going to create civilizational transformation. And there are two factions within this religion. There are the boomers who think that civilizational transformation will be hugely positive. AGI will bring us to utopia. And the other faction believes that transformation will be hugely devastating. AGI could potentially kill all of humanity.
No, just to be clear, you are not, this is not hyperbole. Like I have
No.
seen, this
Yeah.
is very public language. It comes out
Yes.
sometimes in groups of meetings of AI scientists,
Yeah.
where you're right. It's either heaven or hell.
Exactly. It is. I couch it by saying quasi-religious, but you could actually even argue that it is just full-blown religious because they do talk about there's no evidence for either of these things. It is just a deep-seated belief, a spiritual belief. They do use spiritual language. Sometimes they even talk about AGI as them recreating digital gods and demons. You know, that this is the explicit language that they use. And the reason why I say the boomers and the doomers are part of the same, they're factions in the same religion, is because they both then conclude the same thing, which is, oh, we are the good guys. We are the ones that have to be in control of developing this technology. And so there's an inherent anti-democratic conclusion that they arrive to, which is we should not make this a democratic process. We should not be getting lots of input from various people. We should not be opening up this technology to lots of people. We need to keep a tight fist, clamp down on this technology and be secretive about it. In the early days of OpenAI, when it was founded late 2015. There were very few people that believed in the AGI religion. You know, to even speak about the idea that artificial general intelligence was possible meant you were not a serious scientist because this is not based in science. And so the people that were drawn to the explicit premise that OpenAI set out, which was to be bold and ambitious and claim, yes, we are in fact trying to achieve AGI, it only attracted the people who already believed that. And it just so happened that it attracted both of the factions. It attracted the boomers and the doomers. So throughout the history of OpenAI, there has always been these two factions constantly in tension with one another and fighting over how do we actually develop this technology? How should we approach deploying the technology? And one of the things that I concluded through my reporting was it was this tension that really led to the acceleration, the massive acceleration of AI development because
I see. So it feels like if we're thinking like, geez, where'd this come from? Why is AI everywhere? It's not in our heads. Like,
no.
oh, there really was an explosion of productivity because it became a kind of arms race in the industry.
Yes. And the specific moment was when OpenAI decided, ChatGPT was based on a model called GPT 3.5. GPT-3, which was the previous generation, that was a giant step change from GPT-2 in terms of sheer scale of the model. And OpenAI made a very explicit decision at the time where they thought, we have these AI models in the world today, and we have never tried just blowing it up by multiple orders of magnitude. Like multiple orders of magnitude more data, multiple more orders of magnitude of computer chips for training these models. And so whereas GPT-2, I think, was originally trained on maybe a few dozen chips, they decided to train GPT-3 on 10,000 chips, an entire supercomputer, one of the largest supercomputers that had ever been built at the time. And it was that jump that kicked off within the industry the very first race. That was the opening shot that then led a lot of other companies to start swarming around this concept that OpenAI hit on, which is scale at all costs. And after ChatGPT came out, then the race really raised to the next level.
I know you're saying quasi-religion, but if we're taking the metaphor all the way, who is Sam Altman in this world then, right? Like,
Yeah.
is he a pope? Is he a cult leader? Is he, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what is where does he start to fall on the spectrum between boomer and doomer, first of all, since we know he started out cautious? And then second of all, yeah, is it a charismatic leader situation? Like, what are we looking at when we see him in the public space really selling us on his vision?
Can I read you a quote from the opening of my book?
Yes. Oh my gosh, please do. I think I know the one you're going to read,
yeah.
actually.
So I start my book with two quotes side by side. And the one from Sam Altman goes like this. Successful people create companies. More successful people create countries. The most successful people create religions. And this is in quotations that Sam Altman is quoting this. I heard this from Qi Lu. I'm not sure what the source is. It got me thinking, though. The most successful founders do not set out to create companies. They are on a mission to create something closer to a religion. And at some point, it turns out that forming a company is the easiest way to do so. And so I think the answer to your question, who is Sam Altman in this religious? I mean, the thing about this religion that's so interesting is they do not pray to a higher power. They are the ones that believe they're creating a higher power. And Altman, I would say, is sort of like Paul Atreides' mom in Dune.
I love this reference. Keep
was
it
the
going.
one-
Yes.
She was the one that created the myth, that created a religion around Paul Atreides, right? And when people encountered that myth, they didn't understand that it was a creation, so they just believed it. I think that's who Altman is. I mean, this is just based on after doing a lot of reporting and understanding who he is. This is my own conclusion. This is not like I saw some document where he was talking about these things, but I think he understood very, very early on in his career, as evidenced by this quote, that to mobilize people, to mobilize extraordinary resources, you have to create a religious fervor around a quest. And he figured out how to create that by evoking this idea of we are going to create this artificial general intelligence. And to your question of is he a boomer or a doomer, no one really knows. And this was something that was quite interesting when interviewing people for the book, is regardless of how long they had worked with Altman, how closely they had worked with Altman, no one could really say what he believes. And if they were doomers themselves, they thought that maybe Altman was more of a doomer. If they were boomers
Meaning
themselves,
that he cared, that he was concerned, but also the implication was would care about safety and
Yes.
care about these things they're worried about.
Yes. And if they were boomers, they believed that Altman was certainly in their camp and most likely a boomer. And what I realized when I asked people, I would always ask people, what did Sam tell you in this conversation about what he believed and what the company was doing? I realized he always said different things to different people depending on what they wanted to hear. And so ultimately, I think he will choose whether to embody a more boomer ethos or a more doomer ethos based on what is convenient and what he needs to continue mobilizing, not just his employees, but also mobilizing the public, mobilizing regulators, policymakers to move in a direction that is in the best interest of OpenAI.
The quote I thought you were going to read was the one that was it Paul Graham who said this?
Oh.
Somebody said that if you dropped Sam Altman on an island of
Yeah.
cannibals and came back in 5 years, he'd be king.
Yes, that was Paul Graham. Yeah.
I
his
can never
mentor.
unhear that.
Yeah.
His mentor said
His
this
mentor said
as a
this as a compliment.
compliment.
As a
Got it.
compliment.
Okay. So, Karen, I want to move on to something else. The way you just described Altman is actually similar to the way people have described Donald Trump.
Mm.
And I'm bringing this up because we are seeing Altman travel in those circles now,
Hmm.
in part because of the president's embrace of technology. So just for
Hmm.
example, Trump does this 3-country tour of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, brings 50 CEOs, and I'm watching, from my desk on screen, and I see Sam Altman there shaking
Hmm.
hands,
Hmm.
The AI czar is there, David Sachs. He calls it this like game changer in the global AI race,
Hmm.
which the administration thinks like, look, if the U.S. can like cement the position before anyone else, they don't have to worry about China, et cetera. But it was just so wild seeing Altman, in the court of Saudi Arabia,
Hmm.
like helping make this deal happen.
Yeah.
And as we learned in the background reporting, upsetting Elon Musk in the process, who felt
Hmm.
like that OpenAI was getting more attention than he was. It felt like I was watching a moment where world powers were divvying up something.
Yeah.
Only those world powers were tech companies.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the reason why I call my book Empire of AI is a nod to this argument that I make in the book that these companies need to be thought of as new forms of empire. And the reason is because empires of old and empires of AI share all the same features. First, they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they redesign the rules to suggest that it was always their own. So they're scraping the internet saying, this was free for the taking.
Exactly.
But,
Yes.
people did not give their informed consent to the idea that just because you post on social media, you're suddenly going to be fodder for training models that could potentially restrict your economic opportunity. Um, the empires also exploit labor all around the world. And with these AI companies, that not only refers to the fact that they contract a lot of workers around the world that then work in extremely poor conditions to do data cleaning, data annotation, and then content moderation for these companies, but also the fact that these organizations are ultimately building labor automating technologies. OpenAI's definition of AGI is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. So not only is it exploiting labor on the way in, the product is also exploiting labor.
Karen. Okay, that's a lot to unpack. But there are a couple things in there I want to jump in and ask about. You mentioned the labor part of it. We've been talking about AI scientists and venture capitalists and all the people at the top level. And then I'm reading your book and I'm learning it's data workers in Kenya who are, I don't know what, stripping disturbing content out of the
Yeah.
responses. Like, how does this even work? Tell me
Yeah.
about the humans in AI.
Yeah. So there was a part in OpenAI's history, as we talked about, when they started shifting from being more research oriented to realizing they needed some kind of commercialization. And that meant placing their text generation tool that can spew anything into the hands of millions of users. There have been some really infamous scandals in which companies have done this, and then it has been a spectacular failure because then the chatbot suddenly starts saying racist, abusive, toxic things in the hands of those users. And so OpenAI was like, we can't have that happen. We need to build a content moderation filter that we wrap around all of our models so that when a user says something, if the model does start to generate something, the filter blocks it. It never reaches back to the user. And so they contracted workers in Kenya to build this filter. And what these workers did was they had to day in and day out read reams of the worst text on the internet, as well as AI generated text where OpenAI prompted models to imagine the worst text on the internet. And then those workers had to very carefully annotate into a detailed taxonomy is this violent content or is this sexual content? Is this extremely graphic violent content? Is this sexual abuse content? And does that involve children? And for these workers, we see exactly what happened with the social media era and content moderators in social media. They were left deeply traumatized. And it wasn't just the individuals that were left traumatized, it was their communities, their families, people that depended on them, that lost a person that they depended on. And ultimately, they did all this work for $2 an hour. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, when you talk about the logic of empire, I mean, this is one of the clearest illustrations of that logic, where there isn't actually a real justification for why AI researchers get paid $1 million compensation packages, and these workers who could not, these models would not be possible. They would not have the success as products that they do without this labor. And it is the most taxing, harmful labor. And they are paid $2 an hour. The only justification is an ideological one. It is a belief that underpins all empires, that there are superior groups of people that have some nature-given or God-given right to rule over and subjugate inferior people.
And this is before we get to the workers in Colombia, right, who are labeling images for AI training, or, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole here, the environmental impact that is required by these data centers. We've talked about that in other contexts, and suggest our listeners actually check out Terms of Service, which is our podcast on this stuff, and they've gone into it. But it gets to your point that, like, I think we see such a cleaned up version of ChatGPT, to whatever help you do kind of like nonsense tasks, that we don't have an accurate sense of, we don't have a real sense of the cost, the human cost. In a way, it sort of reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever learned about the sugar manufacturing during the slavery era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, sugar and sugar treats and processing it happened in the Caribbean with slave labor.
Yes.
So that you could make like treats and donuts that workers in Industrial Revolution factories could munch on and thus have the energy to work all day.
Right.
And so it's just a donut, but it wasn't just a donut.
It wasn't just a donut. And what was so crazy about it, too, was the land that they were growing that sugar on was then not growing food for people in the Caribbean. So it's not just the human cost, it becomes a country cost where you literally are being dispossessed of the natural resources and the human resources to develop your country further. I mean, that is colonialism, and that is the legacy that we still live with.
And we see
today.
something similar with, is it Uruguay? And also there's a couple countries that have tried to say, like, look, we're going to get on the AI game, and it's cost them.
It has led them to repeat the same thing. So I spoke with activists in both Chile and Uruguay who they were aggressively trying to fight data center expansion within their countries because the governments thought, we really want the foreign direct investment. We want to welcome these companies in to build these data centers. But then the communities that actually have to host the data centers, and these data centers have to use fresh water to cool the overheating of the computers. And that both of those countries, when those data centers came in, were experiencing historic droughts.
There's this a recent poll that found that more than 75% of Americans basically want to slow down AI development to make sure it's done safely or ethically when they're sort of presented with that option. Do you think there is a version of critical public pressure that could have an effect on this conversation?
Absolutely. I mean, I like
Are
to
you sure?
draw...
Because when I see the tech people with Trump, getting sovereign wealth money, I'm like, the jig is up, and he's also clawed back a ton of regulation, right? There's not going to be more regulation in these next 3 years. And that's actually really critical. Like AI isn't like other technologies where we're like, well, in 10 years, this could be a problem. The icebergs are going to melt soonish.
Yeah. Well,
People are giving us like 2-3 year horizons for very serious, for instance, job loss.
right. I mean, is it going to be incredibly hard? Absolutely. But one of the features of empires is that they are made to feel inevitable, but historically, every single empire has fallen. So it really is possible. It's just going to take an extraordinary amount of work. And I like to think about the full AI supply chain. These technologies, there are all of these ingredients that the companies need to build these models. And there are all of these spaces in which they then have to have access to deploy those models. So the ingredients include the data, they include the land, energy, and water for hosting and powering the supercomputers. They include the labor, they include the talent, they include all of the intellectual property that writers, artists, and creators have produced over time. And the spaces in which they need to deploy are schools, businesses, healthcare industry, all of these other types of industries. But one of the things that Silicon Valley has done incredibly well in the last decade is to convince everyone that their resources are in fact Silicon Valley's resources. But we need to remember—
What do you mean by that?
Like, I have friends that will say, there's no data privacy anymore, whatever, they have all of my data anyway, so I'll just continue giving them my data. That's your resource. You have ownership over that. We actually have ownership over our data, our land, our energy, our water. We have ownership over our schools, our healthcare system. These are actually collectively owned or individually owned resources and spaces. And these companies actually need access to it, and we are the ones that grant them access to it. I mean, in this day and age, people just so readily cede that access. But one of the things that I thought was remarkable about stories like the Chilean water activists that I spoke to was they understood fundamentally that this was their water. And they didn't actually have to grant access if they didn't feel like they were getting a mutually beneficial agreement with these data centers. And so when the data center came in and said, we're going to use your water, the Chilean activists were like, what are you going to give us in return? And when they didn't like what they heard, they were like, no, you're not going to use our water. And we are going to make as big of a stink as possible that it's going to escalate from Google Chile to Google Mountain View to the Chilean government. And they were able to pause this data center project for 5 years to the point where finally the company representatives, the Chilean government, and the water activists got into a room, and the water activists were able to have actual dialogue and conversations and say, this is what we would want for our community. It's not that we don't want you to build a data center at all. You just need to actually give us something in return. And I think we need to learn from that spirit, where all of us need to be much more aggressive about protecting our resources and actually entering in mutually beneficial agreements when it is worth it for us.
I'm glad you're saying that, because it's hard not to feel like it's inevitable. You know what I mean? It's hard not to feel helpless. The story of AI is being told that it is out of our hands and that the future belongs to AI. And to your point, in a way, we're all saying, well, I really like convenience. You know what I mean? Like, so I guess, and it's too late now. They have the data. The it's too late now part of it feels a little grim.
Yeah, and the people justifying it by saying, well, I do like the convenience, but then knowing that it's actually not a good bargain. Like, we know that smartphones are not a good bargain. They haven't been good for us, for our kids, We know that social media has not been a good bargain, even though it's been convenient, it's been fun, it's been whatever. But
we're also told, like, this is going to cure cancer. This is going to help us get to Mars. This is going to, like, the AI is going to, AI is going to open ... open
Right.
doors to this or that. And the Industrial Revolution had its benefits. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it had its downsides, but it had its benefits. And I guess the reason why I'm wrestling with this is because, yeah, like, I just had this long conversation with Mustafa Suleyman, and he's very like, this could really help people, I think like any tool,
yeah.
it could. And then I talked to you, and you're just like, Power to the people. Fight these colonizers. And then I Google somewhere else and they're like, well, Skynet's coming. So I don't know what to tell y'all. You know what I mean? Like you're going to be attacked by drones. Find a cave. I hear such conflicting information about how to feel about this industry. And I don't know if it's about the technology itself or about the people involved in it.
Here's what I'll say. When Mustafa Suleyman says it could help people, could is the operative word. And when people say it could be Skynet, could is still the operative word. And what I tried to do with my book is say, this is what is literally happening right now. It's not a could scenario. It is the reality. And this reality should be the best evidence that we have in understanding how AI is impacting people now and how it will continue to impact people in the future, because it demonstrates to us the logic of how this technology is being built and how it's going to work its way through ultimately the fault lines of our society. And right now, it is not looking good. And what I argue is that we need and we can actually turn the ship around, but it cannot be it's too late. There's no role for us. We should just wait for these overlords to hopefully be nice. No, like this is something that we need to aggressively, collectively shape by taking ownership of that data, taking ownership of that land, doing what those Chilean water activists are doing. You know, there are artists and writers that are now suing these companies saying, we don't like the fact that you just trained on our intellectual property. You don't get to do that.
Karen Hao, her new book is called Empire of AI. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.